I'll try to account for the 20 years in between the White House Conference on Families and Charlotte's endeavor. And I'd like to go back to the beginning of that, if I may. The White House Conference on Families was a unique experience for me because I was a mother and a wife, and I accidentally happened to see an announcement advertise the fact that we were having the White House Conference on Families, and locally at the University of Georgia, we were going to have a statewide meeting to select delegates and to talk about proposals. And so I thought, well, and it says people who had families and were interested, feel free to apply. And I thought, well, that looks interesting. So I did get in touch with the number, and the next thing I knew, they did send me a little message and said that I fit the demographic. They had room in my demographic. I was not acquainted with government propositions, so I didn't even know I had to fulfill any sort of requirement for a demographic. At any rate, they said that I could come to the statewide conference. And I began to think, that was my first introduction to, there were things going on in my government that I didn't really understand. And I should have understood. I should know these things. And so I began to sort of go through the process and find out how this worked. At that time, I must tell you that Carter, of course, was our president. He was from Georgia, and I'm from Georgia. In addition to that, our sitting governor at the time was from my hometown, and I had known him growing up. And so when I found out that you had to be in touch with the governor's office to do certain things, I thought, that's no problem. Yeah, I know George. Then I found out there were lots of hoops out there that had nothing to do with your personal relationships or your background or anything else. And that's when I found out that dealing with your government is not always easy. And in that process, I wound up being as it turned out, a government-appointed representative. I'll have to tell you, going through this process, you learn all sorts of things. I learned that we were going to use a Delphi process. I didn't know what that was. But we do have a marvelous group of libraries there at the University of Georgia. And so I went to the science library, checked out the book on Delphi process. And as I started to read, I found out that it was a way of manipulating, conferencing, and manipulating groups of people into accepting points of view. And that made me very angry because I didn't like the idea that I was going to be manipulated in any way, shape, or form. But that helped to arm myself that way, and I began to share that with other people who were going to be going and let them be armed the same way so we would know what we were up against and know when you agree and when you don't agree and how far you go in agreement with somebody that doesn't have your same point of view. So going to Baltimore with the national conference, I decided to go into the education section. My background was drama. It was not education. I had no idea what was going on, except I had a child in school, and that affected me. Education affected me, and it was going to affect my children. So I went and found out that they had all sorts of plans that I had never heard of that had nothing to do with my child being educated. And so it's in that process, we found out, too, that our government did all sorts of interesting things. When we showed up in Baltimore, people I had never heard of and did not know from Adam's house cat knew me by name and face and greeted me without a name tag in the hallways. And that kind of made me feel a little strange. So I know that there were tapings and other things that went on to arm these people with information about us before we ever got there. And that was disturbing. That was back in 1979. But at any rate, I found out that these people who came from all over everywhere, all the organizations like NEA and anybody that had to do with children were armed ahead of time. They had had previous conferences, breakdown conferences, and had already had these position papers. We were issued books that had position papers of all these organizations. Well, if you participate as a citizen, there's nothing in the book from you. But there was supposed to be a certain percentage of people who were citizens who participated in this and who had no background with other organizations. Now, this goes on all the time. This was not unique. This is what happens with every, federal conference about any particular issue. And you have local input, but the overriding input is with your organizations. After that, being the greenhorn that I was, I did not know that when I got upset over that, my local congressman happened to be coming to town to make a speech. And I called out at the country club and I said, would you ask him to call me while he was out there? Well, he did. And I asked him some questions over the phone about this conference. And he said, well, we really didn't know that much about it, but he would look into it for me. And I said, wonderful. And I gave him some points of view about what had happened to me and so forth. And he was very helpful. I did get an opportunity for him to talk to the fellow that ran the conference. And then I found out, he says, why don't you talk to your local legislator? I said, good idea. Didn't know who he was. Found out right quick who my local senator and my local legislative representative was. And so I wrote out a letter to them both, went to their offices, made an appointment, and talked to them and told them what had happened to me and how I happened to step back from being elected. I actually I got elected, but I tied with the bottom person in the conference that day. And so I had to say that I would try to be a governor's appointee. And the man who was running the conference, who really didn't like me because I had talked with him quite often at his office in Atlanta, he said, I'll have to have this was on Saturday afternoon, I'll have to have your resume in my office at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. We're making selections. And I said, Randy, because I had stepped back and let the person I tied with go ahead and be elected because I thought I could get appointed. And he said, 9 o'clock Monday morning. And I said, you've got it. And I went home and I wrote out a letter and I've made copies for my local representatives and I sent it by Western Union. And it was on his office desk Monday morning at 9 o'clock. And I was sitting in my state senator's office that morning at 9:30. And my state senator happened to be an extremely powerful man, which I was happy to find out later, because he picked up the telephone. After I told him what I had been through, he picked up the telephone and called this gentleman and said, I've got a lady here in my district who seems like a reasonable person. She's a local person. She's been involved in things. And you should have her resume there on your office desk. And he said, I think she ought to be part of this group. Well, there was this big long silence on the end of the line, and then I could hear him over the phone talking back to my senator. He was not happy, but I wound up being an appointee. And I found out that's how you do things. And that led to years of being involved in citizen lobbying, because I found out if you want to have your voice heard, you need to go and talk to the people in charge, and you tell them what you want them to know. And most of the time, they don't have the information you do, so you owe it to them to go and share your information. Now, I never took them to lunch. We did not go on golfing outings or anything like that. But at any rate, that was my baptism by fire into what's happening in education. And in so doing, I did manage to connect with other people in my state who were involved in national groups, which I had never been involved in before. And I met a number of them. They were wonderful people. And I got to know many of them extremely well, worked with some of them for over 20 years. The story there is, as long as you're on the same page and you are a team player, then you're all right. When you suddenly began to realize tuition tax credits, vouchers, and charters are not positive, you do not go there, and you say that over and over and over to your legislators, and you say it to the people that you're working with. Most of them say, okay, yeah, right, because you know about that, I don't know about that, you talk to them about that. Fine. But then, at that time, when Reagan went out of office, and I'm sort of skipping around here, the national groups from D.C. started putting themselves down into the states. Heritage opened their Georgia Policy Center. And they have those every state has one. Heritage has their clone in every state, and they decided to move their activities down to the state level. And they raised money, they put out wonderful brochures, all sorts of things, but they never asked the people that they were working with locally, statewide, you know, do you agree with everything that we're doing? They just came in, and some other, well, even Focus on the Family came in and decided that those of us who were working together, that they would start publishing information about our state in their national publication and so forth. We shared what we were doing and with them, and they would put it out so that it could go to the people in your state. Sounded like a wonderful idea, but there's control and control and control. We were not used to having control. We were used to alerting the people in our state with the things that were going on and let them respond, let them talk to their legislators. Not anymore. And then when you get to the point where you are dead set against something that they want to do, suddenly you become anathema. You are not a team player. We cannot allow you to work with us. We will not give you support. We won't answer your phone calls. People that you had as friends and spent the night in their houses and helped their children, all of a sudden we're playing politics. We're not doing policy, and we're not doing issues. We're doing politics. We're going to elect candidates. We're going to be in control. And that was not what those of us who wound up on the outside of the circle looking in were about. We were concerned about these issues. So I wound up on the outside looking in. And that's all right, because I did continue to affect legislation over time, because some of the legislators would call me when they get legislation and they would look at it and they think, you know, these folks want me to do this, but I'm not real sure. And I'd get a phone call and they'd say, you know, we've got this piece of legislation. You're not over here, but I'm telling you what's in this. Why are we not, you know, why are we doing this? And I would say, don't do that. That's not, you know, don't go there. Don't do anything that's going to help vouchers. Don't do anything that's going to take over charters. Don't do that. Don't pass that legislation. So, well, why are these other people telling me? I said, because they're involved in your political activity. And I said, but I'm telling you, don't do it. And he said, get yourself back over here. But you just don't do that. I'd moved on. I thought, okay, I'll do things nationally. I was speaking in some conventions and meetings and things and sharing. So I'll go back now and try to sort of bring you along about some of the other things that were happening during that time. I have a point of view that education is for the intrinsic enhancement of the individual, because the individual can then continue the culture instead of having limited learning for lifelong labor, which is where we're going now. And that's what school to work is. That's what school choice is. That's what the linking of schools and business and industry is. And that's where the charter comes in. C.S. Lewis said when education is supplanted by training, civilization dies. And so that's why we don't do these things. And I remember once actually being accused, say, you're not a team player. And I said, you're right. And when my team is going towards the wrong goal, I'm not going there. I'm going to say, hey, guys, we need to go this way. And so that was just not popular. I was not controllable. After the White House Conference on Families, I became the only person in the state of Georgia or anywhere else that happened to attend school at the University of Georgia who had ever checked out over 100 government documents from the government documents section. I used to carry them around in boxes for presentations to show people, you know, what we were doing and how, you know, here it's written in print. It's not my stuff. These are our government documents that you're paying for. And I would go ahead and recheck them out every time it came time to do, because nobody wanted them. Nobody wanted to look at them. And I had the best time. I mean, oh, really? But I spent hours at the university library. One of the things that I did that for was because when Carter was president, you know, he was very involved in the Global 2000 movement. And a lot of the things that we're dealing with now were part of that Global 2000 projection. And those were the UN and the Club of Rome. All of them were involved in setting forth what was coming in the future. And it's all in Global 2000. And Carter was very supportive of that. And one of the things that came out of that was to find out that there were these things called the human rights treaties that were signed by Truman at the end of World War II. And they were some of the initial documents that came out of some of the initial efforts by the UN. I did not find those in the university library, but a friend had given me a copy, someone that moved out of town, and she said, you know, my husband and I saw these and we were reading them. We were disturbed. You might want to see them. And I kept looking at them and thinking, oh, I don't want to get into that. Big, thick things, you know, little bitty print. And finally I started sort of looking around through some of it. And I was appalled, just appalled, because some of the things that are going on in Agenda 21 were there in those pages. It was the number of how many little units of individual houses could be put on so many pieces of land, how large that piece of land was. This was global. This was not just in South Africa or somewhere. And that had become a real source of concern to me. And I thought, but they're languishing in the Senate. You know, nobody knows about them. Nothing's ever going to happen. In one of the last years when Reagan was president, they were resurrected in the Senate and sent out for the committees to go over and to ratify them. Jesse Helms happened to be one of the people who raised a flag, and what happened was, actually, this was what brought attention to them, was about the International Court, was the idea of the International Court being able to supersede what you do on your country's level. And Jesse Helms did something about that. He did add some wording in there that said, only if the country agrees. And it went back to the beginning of the hate crimes law. This is where the hate crimes legislation came from. And I'll tell you, it was scary when I heard that the Senate was considering ratifying the human rights treaties, because I knew what was in them. They are ratified, and Reagan signed them. They are in effect, and they're the basis for Agenda 21 and for everything else that we see that's a control in our lives. We just don't know where it came from, but there it is. And so that came out of my many hours of spending in the library trying to catch up with where everybody else was in terms of what was going on in our government. And over these years, there's so many opportunities came up for me to learn different things. And I want to go back and make a point of, Charlotte was talking about charters being sort of the first effort to make this changeover in our government and in our education system. Actually, and you'll remember this, some of you that have been in education, school-based management was the first step in that direction. And that came out, and they went into the teacher centers to teach everybody, and the school boards were, presented with that to say, let's do school-based management, the teachers will love it, and so forth and so on. It didn't really work very well, not in our area. The county for Athens and the county for where I live, which is Watkinsville, we're a little more rural, but we merged together. But then after that came the charter proposition. And I lobbied against that proposition, and with Christian schools in our state, not to vote for or support voucher legislation, because the single dollar they took was going to control their school. Once you take a government dollar, you have to meet government standards. And I don't like to point fingers at one particular group, but I will, because they were the ones responsible for doing all of the things that happened in our state, and I think everywhere else as well. We had a group out of Heritage who came to hold hearings on legislation for vouchers in our state. And we had a marvelous little group of senators who were brought in there to hear these presentations, and they were being very receptive of all the different people. In fact, they even talked the homeschool people into coming in and asking for state dollars to help them do their homeschool because they say that we're paying taxes twice. If we pay for the schools that we don't use, and then we're having to pay for our own education. I was on the long list because I got there a little bit later, and I just went and sat and talked to the legislators. And I said, you know, our state constitution says you are responsible for making available education for our children. And I said, and if you go home and tell anyone in your district that they can take our tax dollars and give them to any private school, any entity in our state, without your having control of what happens there, you just better go home, because you don't have any business sitting in those chairs up there, because you're lying to your people. If you're telling, well, I had some senators afterwards who came up to me and said, we had no idea that you felt that way. And thank you for saying that. Nobody else was, they were kind of in a hot spot because, all of it was positive, and they thought, well, yeah, maybe we can work with this and so forth. And I just told you, you don't monkey with the law just because somebody thinks it's a good thing. That was Global 2000. All of our Republican representatives were co-opted into supporting everything that was in Global 2000, including the standards, the changeover in the educational process. This was true in our state, and going for choice. We slowed the horse down for a while until, of course, we wound up with a Republican governor and a Republican-led legislature, the first time, these last 12 years, the first time in the history of Georgia that we've had the Republicans in control. And we have nothing but trouble, if you don't mind my saying so. The Democrats were not great. We will say the Democrats were not great. That was not the point. It's just that we weren't going down that trail. And I say a we, and I'll own up to this. I did help work in one governor's election process, and they thought, the people in his group thought it would be great fun to play a trick on Cindy, because they knew that I was really not a Democrat at that point. At that point, I really wasn't a Republican either. But they thought it was a great idea to say, we're going to put Cindy on the state Democratic committee and see what she does. And so they did. They appointed me to the state Democratic committee, and I said, okay, all right, because I knew the governor, and I thought we were on the same track about what we were doing. And it gave me, they didn't realize what they were doing. I would go to these statewide meetings and sit right amongst our legislators. And I was there with them all day long. I got to talk to them and wear them down, And then when I'd go to the Capitol and encounter them, we'd been together. They knew me. And so it was a great tool. And I used it for our purposes, those of us who were there lobbying for issues, not for politics, but for issues, because I could call someone out and they would come out in the hall and talk with me, and I could share with them. And so I did that for 12, in fact, I was appointed and then I was elected because they decided that I was the person that made their point of view, that they were inclusive as a party, that I made that real. I was their face of inclusiveness. So it worked out really well, but now we're in a different situation, and we have real problems. And everybody thought that when we put the Republicans in power, everything was going to be great. Sort of like when we voted Reagan in, everything was going to be great. Everybody went to sleep. And that's what's happened. And we are down such a road, it's unbelievable. Agenda 21 out the wazoo, and just, everything happening. I wanted to share with you some of the things that I learned over these years. After the White House Conference on Families, I did some journalistic work, and I went to some conferences and so forth. Some of them were some World Future Society conferences, which were very, very interesting. And I encountered there some of our Republican and some of our quote-unquote conservative people who were there amongst other people who were not. And they were going right along with them. In fact, they were giving them ideas. And I thought that was quite fascinating. I did come out of some of that, and I wrote an article which you can access on the internet, and it's called When is Assessment Really Assessment? That word had bothered me for a long, long time. I'd been asked to go down to Brunswick, Georgia, to give a presentation, and they gave me a list of things they wanted me to do a glossary for, and one of them was the term assessment, because that's what everybody was using then. You know, assessments. We're going to do assessments. We've got assessments coming. And I looked up the definition of assessment in the dictionary, and it said, this was the definition: to set an estimated value on property, etc., for taxation. The second definition: to set the amount of a tax, fine, damages, etc. The third definition: to impose a fine, a tax, or special payment on a person or property. The fourth definition: to impose an amount as a fine or a tax, etc. The fifth definition was to estimate or determine the significance, importance, or value of, to evaluate. And I have never found another definition in any other dictionary. That was a new dictionary that I had used at the time. And I began to think, why are the educationists using the term assessment? What does that really mean? And so as time went on, one of the things that we encountered was references to with planning, programming, and budgeting system. I remember visiting my superintendent's office, and he had the whole row of handbooks there in his office. First of them was the Handbook 2 for Financial Accounting, and that's where planning, programming, budgeting was fit into. They've since changed it to GAP and GAFR or something like that. But at any rate, this was in the federal accounting program. So this was my response to that. And this was the end of a presentation that I gave on the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. In my testimony, I said, if our financial resource reporting is going to be unified by such a system, which is the planning, programming, and budgeting system, then are we not but a step away from unified goals for our educational outcomes? Now, this was in 1984. This is assuredly a step toward mandated national curriculum and interstate and interregional tax and financial management revisions. Will we not soon be sharing tax resources from region to region as needed to equalize educational opportunities and programs deemed exemplary or in the national interest to produce global-minded citizens? I didn't know all of that stuff. It just was an outgrowth of, as I was writing my testimony, that's just kind of where it led. That was in 1984, when none of us had even seen any of this before that. But it led to that kind of thinking. John Linder was my federal representative. And you know how much I'm going to love what I have to say about Mr. John Linder, because he is much involved with the fair tax, which is not fair in any way, shape, or form, and it is leading directly to what was said right here. That is what you use the fair tax for. And that's where we're headed. And that really did upset me, but when I realized that then they could let the money follow the child anywhere. If the money follows the child can go anywhere. And if we have equalization of how much money goes to individual children, if your child needs special help or whatever, and there's a school in Oklahoma, let's just send that child out there. There'll be somebody that can take care of them out there. And of course, the Chinese have introduced the whole proposition where you've got and we have dormitories that have been built in some states to house children from out of state. So we just do this. We just move things around. The family's not that important. The Chinese will tell you that, you know, they have a problem there because they only have one child per family. And so if they go and live in a dormitory and are there all week with people, with other children and so forth, it helps them socialize. I had that wonderful little Chinese lady that was at the Second Model Schools Conference with Willard Daggett who gave this little proposition to the people there, who just applauded, thought she was wonderful. And I sat there and thought, my word, what have we come to? My tax money is bringing people here to hear this from her. And, you know, she's saying, let's break up our families and let our children be taken care of elsewhere. After that, and going through, the next thing that I found was the book about human capital and America's future, which was edited by David Hornbeck and Lester Solomon. And in that, I'll read one of the little quotes there. If the new comprehensive system is to be outcome-based, careful attention must be paid to assessment strategies. The selection of outcome indicators will be informed by the availability of sound assessment instruments. Well, here we're talking about human capital, we're talking about business, and they're talking about assessment instruments. Well, tests are instruments. Assessments in education are instruments. So how does this really relate to education? The next thing that Hornbeck said, similar sensitivity is required in carefully defining appropriate assessment tools in other areas as well. In citizenship, a method should be developed for expressing qualitative aspects of participation activities. A different value could be placed on community service. Physical and mental fitness problems arise as we confront legal and even constitutional issues, self-incrimination, search and seizure. Perhaps a school system should plan to have all students undergo a physical exam in the 4th, 8th, and 12th grades as a health counterpart to the academic testing program. Again, the emphasis must be carefully determined assessment strategies that measure the outcomes to be achieved. I was trying to close on what the real definition, the education definition of assessment is. The next thing that came about, I ran across something called Visions, which was a newsletter put out by the Pacific Telesis Education Foundation in California. And in their little publication called Beyond the Bubble, they had a blurb that described, what different terms were, and that says educators are finding that new ways of teaching requires new forms of, and they had in quotations, assessment. Then, on their definition of assessment, it said, the act or result of judging the worth or value of something or someone. Well, we kind of come full circle about what assessment means. Then, after that, Alvin Toffler was referenced in that same little publication, and it said, Alvin Toffler, the author of such influential books as Future Shock and the Third Wave, has written that the spread of personal computers is the single most important change in the field of knowledge since the invention of movable type in the 15th century. He goes on to state that knowledge is the key to power in the 21st century, not mineral rights or military force. That was Alvin Toffler. Now, we're going to come to Mr. Gingrich, who was our Speaker of the House. And the year that he was elected to be Speaker of the House, they hosted in Atlanta a conference called Cyberspace of the American Dream. That was Mr. Toffler's book called Creating a New Civilization, The Politics of the Third Wave. And Gingrich's organization, Progress and Freedom Foundation, published that for Mr. Toffler. This meeting was brought about to introduce his book and to have a signing and let him explain his ideas for the future. And at that particular meeting is when I found out that Newt Gingrich and Mr. Toffler had been very close friends for over 25 years at that point, and that was back in the 90s. And at that particular conference, there was a gentleman there that was representing their point of view in education. His name is Louis Pearlman. He wrote a book called Schools Out. That's one of the things he wrote. He also had written a book called Hyperlearning. Hyperlearning is learning what you need to know when you need to know it. You don't learn it before. You don't learn it, later. You don't learn it in an abstract way. You learn it when you need to know it. That's training. That's not learning. That's not education. But here is what he says this on page 316 of his book. Nostalgic mythology about local control should not mask the reality that state governments have the constitutional authority, call the shots, and pay most of the bill for education. But government, local or otherwise, no longer needs to own and operate school systems or academic institutions. Here we are at charters and privatization and the money following the child. He also makes this longer statement. If y'all bear with me as I read this, one possibility would be a human capital tax. The human capital tax might be simply the same as a personal income tax. Remember, we're doing away with personal income tax. We're going to fair tax. We're going to individual tax, human capital tax. Or might be calculated or earmarked in a more limited way. Technicalities aside, it's logical that if the government is going to help fund investments in the development of a community's human capital, taking back a share of the resulting gains is a good way to pay for it. In effect, each generation of beneficiaries of such investment pays back some of the benefits it received to the next generation, a value-added tax. We should deal with parents who are starving their children's minds with the same legal remedies we use to deal with parents who are starving their children's bodies. The media through which a micro-voucher system is provided will give public authorities more accurate information on what individual families and kids are doing than is currently available, making it easier to identify instances of neglect and abuse. There's no good reason why the learner should not be able to purchase services or products from any provider, whether public or private, in-state or out-of-state. Yep. Mr. Perlman was Gingrich and Progress and Freedom Foundation, which now has gone through, morphed into, I'm not sure what it's called now, but it's the same organization. And he was their mouthpiece. This was the position. And that's, I call it, the Trojan horse of conservative politics. There's nothing conservative about these politics or these proposals. And so when is assessment really assessment? And Ernest Boyer had said, to be fully human, one must serve. And in the future, to be fully assessed may mean that our children's worth as a servant of the state will be assigned a value for tax purposes. And that was a little piece that came out of my attempt to write a glossary. And it led me to encounter several things that were very uncomfortable to see and that are already in process. That is the problem. And all the things that came out, Mr. Toffler, after Gingrich stood there and the dinner meeting that particular night, glowingly talked about all the wonderful things he and his wife Heidi had done and all of the books that they'd written and so forth. Mr. Toffler, one of the main points that he made in the speech that he made following that was that there's no such thing as national sovereignty. National sovereignty was a thing of the past. To applause from the audience. So when he did that, afterwards I went up and asked him, because I was there as a journalist, and I asked him to explain his position on national sovereignty to me just in a few words. He says, oh, it's been gone for a long time. Aren't you aware of that? There's no such thing as national sovereignty. Everything is global. And I said, well, thank you very much for that little piece of information. And since that time, that's the way they've been operating. And they were there at that particular meeting with a number of people. One of the people that they had there was the governor's office was representative from New Mexico because they were going to propose doing this conference of the states, which is the same thing as a constitutional convention. The constitutional convention didn't appeal to anybody, and that got defeated, so they came back with the idea, we'll call it a conference of the states. It's just a conference. It's not a convention. But they would have binding resolutions. So he was there to present his case, and they all were very happy. And Heritage was there. I can't tell you all the organizations that were represented at that particular meeting. But it's very difficult to tell people who've been given money to organizations for years, you are throwing your money down a rabbit hole when they think you just don't know what you're talking about. there were so many different organizations that were doing so many different things at that time. One of the things that was going on was Wyrick was doing the Free Congress research, and Heritage were joined together to do ALEC, to create the American Legislative Exchange Council. And I encountered that even our Democratic representatives and our Democratic Speaker of the House was involved with ALEC. And something came through from ALEC. They gave it, good shrift. They would listen. And when I found out what ALEC was doing, they had decided that ACIR, Advisory Council on Intergovernmental Relations, it was in Washington. They prepared legislation, and they did overviews of legislation in particular areas, and it was provided to the legislators in Washington. ALEC was doing the same thing. They decided that we would do an alternative. We would do an alternative system of processing legislation, and we do it from the, what did he call it? Building a parallel institution. That's what we did with ALEC, was a parallel institution to ACER. It would just be conservative. And at that time, in Georgia, Democrats in Georgia were basically like Republicans in other states in terms of their conservative point of view of the world. And so I really wasn't that uncomfortable with being a Democrat at that time. That has since changed somewhat. But they listened to ALEC, and they sent representatives to ALEC's meeting. In fact, they even sent through some legislation about the Conference on the States, and to ratify the idea to call people to go to see the conference, to go to the Conference on the States if we had one. Prior to that, before Mr. Linder became a federal legislator, he was a state legislator, and we had a few of us who were not organized yet and had not been run out on a rail, decided that we would go back over our legislation and try to rescind our call for a constitutional convention to balance the budget. You remember that? When it went out, everybody did the thing to balance the budget. Okay. Well, we tried to go back, and we got a number of legislators who said, yes, you bring it to the floor, we'll vote for it, and rescind that, because nobody wants to do that anymore. Until Jack Kingston, who was the vice chairman of the committee that was going to handle that, who agreed that he would help us do that, came to us one day after lunch, and he said, I can't help you. And we said, no, we didn't know that. Why not? And he said, well, I've gotten a lot of support and help because I'm going to run for Congress from John Linder down in my district, and he doesn't want us to do this. And we said, oh, but we've gotten all this support for it. The Democrats are on board, and Republicans. We got it made. He said, well, I can't do it. And so we said, okay. And it died. But it didn't die a natural death. At the committee meeting, John Linder introduced 2 more pieces of legislation calling for constitutional conventions on other grounds, so that if we'd gotten that one rescinded, we would have had another one. So I was not very enamored of Mr. Linder because he had shown his colors early on. And I know that he's out there working now to get this fair tax passed, and it just cannot happen, because if he's behind it, it's going on a rail to nowhere for this country. After that, the World Future Society meetings that I went to, Beth went to one of them with me, and we encountered some people who were talking about the new way we were going to do computers. As you well know, computers do many things to many people's minds, and getting between the computer and the child would be a healthy thing. However, what they want to do now is to make them oral and oral. That means you can listen and you can talk. You don't have to use a screen. You don't have to be able to type. You don't have to be able to translate the language. You can get it orally and orally. And you can walk around with a little bud in your ear and listening, and you can talk back, and the computer will print out what you say in whatever language you want to say it. I was there again as press. at that particular meeting, and there were some teachers sitting behind us that were very excited about this. They thought this was a great thing. And so I just raised my hand, and he waited a long time before he ever recognized me. And I was sitting next to a man from IBM, and he had been taking some notes, but he'd been folding his things up to get ready to leave. And I finally got to ask my question, which was, if we are oral and oral on computers and we don't have anything tangible to use, even software, what's to prevent me from being guided in only one direction and given information from only one source? I said, I can go down to your bookstore that they had there, and I said, I can find 2 or 3 books on the same subject, and I said, I can compare those authors, and I can take from it a lot of different things from a lot of different perspectives. And I said, but you plug my ear in and make me talk to the computer. I don't have anything but that. I don't have anything to compare it to. And he didn't really have a good answer, but it was, oh, no, it's not going to work that way. And the teachers behind me were saying, oh, no, it won't be limited or whatever. I said, why not? And the gentleman from IBM was folding up his suitcase, and he got up to leave, and he turned around to me and he says, Madam, you're correct. And then he turned around and left the room. And I thought, okay, that's where we are, particularly in the developing countries, because that was the whole thing. They could do it out under a tree. They didn't have to be in a room. They didn't have to be air conditioned. You know, we could do it anywhere in the world. That's where we are. And the gentleman from IBM says, yes, you're correct. And I'll have to say this for IBM. IBM trains their people to really say it like it is in many instances. And I'll relate one. Charlotte and I had gone to the governor's conference in Minnesota. It's a governor's conference on TQM, Total Quality Management in Education, which was a huge conference, and it was an extremely interesting one. And one particular day, we kind of wound up in a place that we weren't really supposed to be, but they didn't run us out. They didn't know any better than to let us in. And it was superintendents and teachers and other people in education and administration, state levels and federal levels and all, in this one meeting. And this facilitator from IBM was giving the presentation. And they had been talking about how to change, how to change the teachers and the administrators and get them to go into these new directions in education. And one superintendent had raised his hand. He said, I've got a lot of older teachers in my system who are great teachers, and he said, but they're not going to follow me down these paths. How do I deal with them? And the little lady she was a sweet little lady, from IBM, did her little thing, her little stick that came out like this, and she had her flow chart, on the wall behind her. And she says, no problem. She says, you observe, you watch them, you document their mistakes, and she touched us. She said her little box that she hit was waste management, and you get rid of them. It was that simple. He said, okay. And nobody else said anything else. And we were sitting there kind of in shock, But it was just as clear as a bell. There was no question. You just move them out of the way. Keep going, move them out of the way. They don't get on board, you just get rid of them. And then from that, I'd like to say something about the National Center for Educational Statistics. They developed these handbooks. We were trying to get copies of them. We were seeing references to handbooks. Nobody had the handbooks. We didn't know where they were, and we couldn't get them. I went to the library. They didn't have them there. Not at that time. They did get them later. I asked them. All right. I went to a meeting that Larry McDonald, any of you remember Larry McDonald, who died in the airplane crash going to Russia. He was speaking one night. I was there covering it. And afterwards, went up to him and I said, Mr. McDonald, I'm trying to get hold of a government document. Would you assist me? And he said, I'll try. He said, write it out and I'll give it to my people. And I told him, there are handbooks that are developed by the Department of Education. Could I get a copy of those? About a week or so later, in the mail came this huge package falling apart. And there were 8 handbooks there. There were more than what I asked for. He was not even my representative. But the 8th one, we found out that the mapping process, which was illegal at the time, they had mapped the United States down to the local school system And they had everybody mapped down to that extent, where they had the coding. See, these handbooks were for the computer coding for everything that happened in education. It's like medicine. You know, you have certain codes that you do for certain diseases and procedures and all that, and you ship it on off. Well, by the time the information that you've got about your assessments and all that sort of stuff comes together, then you've got it in these codes that match these handbooks, and that's how it goes to the federal government. And in this particular handbook, we found all of the stuff about community education and how it was going to be put in. Handbook 8, which they now say, well, we don't use Handbook 8 anymore. No, they don't have to, because have all the coding down to the individual teacher and the individual child, which we got those later. Those were later handbooks.
A lot on values.
Oh, yes, the whole section on values and how you code them and how you code changes. It was amazing. And the fact that it was collected down to the school system level. We were completely controlled and nobody knew. A couple of us made an appointment, went to see Mr. McDonald, because I thought it was only fair, you know, to show him what we had that he had gotten for us. And we went to his office and laid them out there on the table, strategic pages of different ones, and explained what was happening and how it was happening and how it wound up in the community education and, you know, how they were doing these things. And he sat down in a chair and looked at it and he said, so that's what they're doing with that money. And he said, can you come and speak to my staff? And I said, well, sure, we'll be glad to come and tell you. He says, they need to know this. He said, we did not know what these handbooks were. Well, he died before then. And so we never got an opportunity to do that. Yes. Well, let me see if I can sort of wind this up for you. In the meantime, I did work with Sarah Leslie on the Christian Conscience. We tried to get out as much information as we could through the magazine. And during the process of that, we put out some information about the Parental Rights and Responsibilities Act, which was Michael Ferris, who is identified as Homeschool Legal Defense and the homeschooler's God, as you were. He's part of the Trojan Horse, has been for many, 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 many years. And the Parental Rights and Responsibilities Act was part of a three-pronged effort to actually put some controls in for parental activity. And you don't add that type of wording into legislation unless you want it to be activated. And if you don't already have those controls in place, you don't put them there. But Mr. Ferris and I disagreed on that. We had quite I wrote a long treatise about him, and we had 2 or 3 exchanges of different things. And Professor Rice at Notre Dame University agreed with me, and he went on record and about that, and that kind of died. However, I've discovered on the net that Mr. Ferris is back at it again with a little different twist this time, same thing. Homeschoolers, you have to understand, if the people come and knock on your door at night, who are you going to call if they want to do something about your children? Homeschool Legal Defense. Why are you going to do that? Because they'll come and help me. No, they will not. They say right there in the charter, they do not do that. They don't go to court for you. They don't participate. Your best bet is to educate a local lawyer about your situation, where you are in homeschooling, what you think your situation might be if somebody decides to give you some problems. And then you have somebody to call that will go to court for you, who will help you and take care of you. Homeschool Legal Defense will take your money, and they will send you lots of literature, and they'll give you some good ideas. They do some things very well. However, they will not be there by your side. The best thing for you to do is even keep a lawyer on retainer for that same money that you would have been sending, because they will not do that for you. And that's another Trojan horse issue. Yeah.
We're talking about homeschoolers. I'm sorry to interrupt you. William Bennett, Secretary William Bennett, has a charter school, a virtual academy, and there are homeschoolers who
right, K-12.
were working with him. They were about to adopt this for homeschooling, and they said, what test will we have to administer, Secretary Bennett? And he said, oh, the federal national assessment. That's federally funded. He said the NAEP is federally funded, supported by tax money. My virtual academy is a charter school. That's a complete federal curriculum.
I will do one thing about that, because he has since moved away from that and received money out, his money investment back, and he's separated himself from it. But those are charter schools. They are not private. They are public schools, and they not only are subject to the NAEP, they are subject to the state level assessments as well. The homeschoolers just have to realize that if you're going to homeschool, it's going to cost you, and you're going to have to just do it, and that's what you're going to have to do. It's just like if you're going to be involved in issues, be involved in issues. Don't get involved in politics, or you do the same thing you're going to do with the homeschooling. If you take any money or you get involved in any way, shape, or form looking for relief. All right, this is very short and quick. This is to amplify something that I was telling you earlier about the Progress and Freedom Foundation meeting with Gingrich and Toffler and George Gilder and Kenilworth, several people. At that point, they were doing a TV show that afternoon about education. Louis Perlman was on the panel as well. And what they said was, you have to remember that in the future, education will be from the home. It's the global cottage. But the schools will be used for socialization, which is exactly what Malcolm Davis had told Charlotte, and it keeps getting repeated over and over and over until we get it, folks. We're supposed to get it eventually. But that was broadcast over the conservative television program, which was funded by Moon out of D.C., and used by Gingrich and others to get their point across. And that's another important little milestone, that at that point in the 90s they were saying again, it's going to be done in the home with computers and the school for socialization. There's one thing that's happening in Georgia, and many of your states have been watching it. We have a Supreme Court decision in our state that stopped the state from establishing an entity that would charter schools outside the purview of the state board or the local board. Who knows why the legislature did this? They knew it was not constitutional, but they set it up. It operated for over a year. They involved 13 different charters that they approved through this commission. They appointed members of the commission. They chartered these 13 schools, one of which is a distance learning cyber school. Well, when the state Supreme Court said, you cannot do this because our state constitution says there can be no special schools except those chartered by the Board of Education for special needs. We have a school for the deaf. We have a school for the blind. Those are special schools chartered by, and, well, they're not charters, but they were created by the state, and they are state schools. And those are the only special schools around in Georgia. This commission was creating these charters as special schools. So what we have now, and if you all please put us on your prayer list, in November, we have on our ballot a constitutional amendment to allow the state legislature to appoint a commission to charter schools outside the purview of the state board or the local boards of education. And so if you'll just please remember us that in November we can settle this issue and maintain our status as not being able to approve charter schools without permission of either the local boards of education or the state board. The state board can, at this point, charter a school if there's an appeal process where if you try on the local level and you don't get it, you can appeal to the state, but it's to the state board. And the state board says, no, that's it. You just may as well go ahead and declare yourself a private school and get on with it. But we do need your prayers in this election cycle, because if this amendment passes, then the state has control and they can commission any way they want to. I know some of your other states have sort of looked to Georgia's situation to dictate what they can do. because probably your constitution say the same thing. I do want to wind up one thing. Later on, with regard to this whole process of going to different conferences and things, did wind up in one that was very important. Empower America had this marvelous conference on school choice. And I went to cover that. It was held in D.C. at the Press Club. And William Bennett was there, and a number of people, Jeannie Allen was there, and a number of people. And there were some people from Washington State, whose last name was Spady, but they were not related to William. They were Richard Spady's children, and that was Dick's Hamburgers. If you go out to Washington State, if you go see Dick's Hamburgers, that's Dick Spady, Richard Spady. His son and daughter-in-law had put in a charter drive and a tuition tax credit proposal. They had gotten all of the conservative organizations on board. They were there at the Empower America conference to tell everybody how it could be done. And so they had all this material. They left before I could get to them personally. They had to leave. And so I didn't get to ask them for what they had, but I really wanted to see it. 2 weeks later, I was in Atlanta for a World Future Society meeting, and on the agenda was Mr. Spady from Washington State, who was there to come to back up some of the things that were going on at the World Future Society, to tell them how he did what he did. I got hung up with some traffic, and I didn't get there to hear his whole speech, but I was there in the back of the room when he left the podium. And when he came by me, I flagged him down and told him, I said, I'd like to interview you for a moment. I was not here to hear what you had to say, but I would really like it if you had anything in writing that you could give to me. He said, oh, no problem, give me your room number. He thought I was staying in the hotel. And I'll get it to your room. And I said, well, I'm not staying at the hotel. I said, I'm actually from out of town. I'll be going back home later on this afternoon. And he said, no problem, picked up his cell phone, called his office in Washington State. I wrote my information down. He says, I'll have them send you the material. I said, thank you so very much. I really appreciate that. And we went on with a little interview thing, and I learned all sorts of things about what he was doing. He sent me this huge trifolder with letters from every conservative organization that you can think of, including many of the surrounding state heritage clones were also sending their things in. And, lots of odd organizations as well. We think it was odd. They were not conservative, but they were, yes, NEA was behind them. They were all behind him. We have been had, and partly it's, I look at some of these organizations, and I think part of it is because these are issues that you can raise money on, that you can support your organization, that you can get your people busy doing, and they will stay busy and diverted. They will be diverted from what needs to be done, but they will stay busy and they will send you money. And that is one of the problems that we have in politics. Politics is the use and abuse of power. I was telling the girls the other day what I had explained to a government student of mine on the cuff, one day. He says, what is politics, Ms. Weather? And I said, well, and it just popped into my head, it's the use and abuse of power. And after I thought about it, I said, yes, it's the use and abuse of power. That's what politics is. And so we need to remember that that's what we're dealing with. Anything we do that's political in nature in any way, shape, or form, that's what we're dealing with. Either we're going to be used or abused. So be very, very careful. And thank you for your time, and I appreciate your attention.